Welcome to the deep dive. Like when you hear about a case and you just know, like right away, that there's got to be more to the story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
Okay.
You listeners have sent in, well, actually court documents about a pastor in the Philippines, Young-oh, found guilty of qualified human trafficking.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but that phrase, qualified human trafficking, that really piqued my interest. What exactly does that even mean?
So that's actually a super important distinction in this case.
Basically.
Qualified human trafficking means the crime carries a much, much steeper penalty.
Okay.
Because in this case, the victims were minors.
Yeah.
And there were multiple victims.
Yeah.
So because of that, Young-oh is facing life in prison.
Life in prison. Wow,
Right.
that tells you right there that this is not, just some average everyday court case.
Right.
He ran a religious school called Redacted to match source. And, well, the accusations against him are really heavy stuff. But let's back up for a second. What exactly landed this guy in court in the first place?
So Young-oh, he was accused of recruiting minors under, well, let's just say false pretenses. He promised them free theological education.
Okay.
So these kids, they thought they were headed to classrooms, to learn and grow spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, they ended up on construction sites, forced to work incredibly grueling hours.
So instead of, studying scripture, they were, laying bricks, mixing cement?
Yeah, sadly, yes.
Wow.
And we're not talking about just like an hour here or there. We're talking like long, long hours, often working like late into the night.
Oh, my God.
All while being told that this was somehow part of their, religious training.
That's just, okay. So to be found guilty of human trafficking, specifically qualified human trafficking, what did the prosecution actually have to prove in court?
That's a really good question. So
Yeah.
they had to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Young-oh's actions met three very specific criteria. The first one was like the actual prohibited acts of trafficking.
Okay.
The second, the means that he used to carry those acts out.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, his exploitative purpose.
Okay, let's unpack those a little bit. Starting with, the prohibited acts, what exactly did he do that constitutes trafficking?
Well, the court documents, they're very clear on this. They found that he recruited these minors, transported them within the Philippines, and he did so under false pretenses. He promised them, remember, a free theological education, which obviously, never materialized.
So he, lured them in with this promise of something that they desperately wanted, something that he used to gain their trust, essentially.
Exactly.
Ugh, that's just despicable. What about the means part? How did that factor into the court's decision?
So this is where the manipulation, I think, becomes really, really clear. He used their faith, right, and his position as a pastor to exploit these minors. They were far from home. Some of them had even been separated from their families, and he presented himself as this guiding figure, someone to be trusted completely. And I think that created a huge power imbalance, which made it, almost impossible for these kids to resist or even question his demands.
So it's not just about the physical act of forcing them into labor. It's also about the psychological manipulation that was used to make them believe that they were, obligated or even blessed to do this work.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. And that feeds directly into that third criteria, that exploitative purpose. Young-oh argued that the students worked voluntarily out of their own, religious devotion. But the court saw right through that. They highlighted that coercive environment he created, and again, that inherent power imbalance. These were kids, some of them as young as redacted to match source, working incredibly grueling hours, all under, this guise of religious duty. And it was all for his benefit.
It's just, honestly, it's like something you'd see in a movie or something.
Yeah.
These poor kids, miles from home, putting all their faith in someone who's supposed to be, nurturing their spirits.
Right.
Not literally working them to the bone.
It's awful.
It really is. Okay, so I have to ask, the practical question here. How does a court even begin to sort of unravel something like this?
Yeah.
I mean, how do they determine, what's genuine religious service versus what's straight up exploitation?
That is where it gets really, really interesting. So the court, they didn't just look at this case through the lens of Philippine law.
Okay.
Although obviously that was key.
Right.
They actually went a lot deeper. They connected this case to international conventions and even human rights declarations.
So they were looking at, the bigger picture, the global standards for what is considered exploitation.
Exactly. And the court documents, they actually walk us through this whole thing. They start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, you know, very clearly states that everyone has the right to be free from slavery and forced labor.
Which seems pretty straightforward, I guess, when you put it like that.
Right. I mean, it's pretty clear. But they actually go a step further, and they bring in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime.
Okay.
Specifically, the protocol that deals with human trafficking.
Okay.
And this is where things get, like, super specific about prevention, prosecution, and even, like, the protection of victims.
So they're like establishing this very clear framework
Exactly.
to show that the Philippines isn't just dealing with this internally. They're aligning their decisions and their actions with like international law.
Exactly. What they're doing is they're sending a very clear message that the Philippines, they take human trafficking very, very seriously, and they're part of a global effort to combat it. And it's not just talk. Like, they cite some honestly really kind of sobering statistics from a UNODC report that shows just how widespread human trafficking really is.
See, and that's what's so disturbing about all of this.
Yeah.
This isn't just an isolated incident. We're
Right.
talking about like a global epidemic.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the international context, right? We've got, what the Philippines is doing. But ultimately, this case hinges on the experiences of those minors.
Right.
Do their voices come through in any of the documents?
Oh, absolutely they do. And to protect their identities, the court document, like aliases like AAA, BBB, and CCC.
Oh, of course.
But their stories are, honestly, they're really harrowing.
Yeah.
They were lured in with these, like, promises of education and, all this opportunity.
Right.
And they ended up, like, completely trapped in this awful cycle of, like, grueling physical labor, all under, again, under this guise of religious duty.
Hearing that, you can't help but wonder, like, what kind of lasting impact does something like that have on a young person?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they were betrayed by somebody that they trusted, someone who clearly held like a huge amount of power over them.
Yeah.
That has to have consequences, above and beyond the physical labor.
Yeah, you're so right. And while the court documents don't get into, like, the long-term psychological effects on these kids, we have to, like, just acknowledge the emotional and spiritual trauma that this kind of abuse inflicts.
Right.
I mean, imagine being told that your suffering is somehow pleasing to God.
Gosh.
That your exhaustion is like a measure of your devotion. It's a really devastating manipulation of faith.
Gosh, it really is heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, like, how can anyone take something like faith, something so pure, and twist it into, a tool for exploitation like this?
Right.
Did the court address that at all?
Oh, yeah, they did. They absolutely called out Siyounggo's actions for what they were. A very clear, very calculated exploitation of, of these kids' religious beliefs.
Wow.
He tried to justify this forced labor as some kind of, like, spiritual training, like it was a sacrifice they were making, for their future as pastors and missionaries or something.
Right.
But the court, they didn't buy it, not for a second.
Yeah.
They saw this for what it was. A cynical manipulation of their faith to, honestly, just to serve his own interests.
So they saw right through his facade.
Totally.
They recognized that even if the victims, initially believed that they were serving some higher purpose, it doesn't matter.
Right.
His actions were still completely illegal.
Illegal and honestly just morally reprehensible.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's a powerful statement because it sets a precedent for future cases like this.
Right.
That using religion as some kind of shield for exploitation.
Yeah.
It's not going to fly.
No.
Not anymore.
And that brings us back to, like, the sentence here.
Yeah.
Life imprisonment. I mean, that's about as serious as it gets. It
Yeah.
really underscores, like, the gravity of everything he did.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's not just about punishment either. I mean, the court, they also ordered Siyoung to pay some, like, pretty hefty fines.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 2 million Philippine pesos, plus another 600,000 to each victim on top of that.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
It is.
That's a hefty price to pay, both literally and figuratively, I think, in this case.
Yeah,
So it seems like this is more than just about one man's actions.
I think so too.
It's about, like, sending a message.
It is. It's about the Philippines saying, hey, we see what's happening here. We're not going to stand for this. And then by aligning their actions with, those international laws, they're adding their voice to what is, thankfully, a growing global movement to stop this.
Right. It's this reminder that, we all have a part to play in combating trafficking. It's not enough to just be aware of it. We have to be active in our communities, support organizations that are fighting against this, speak up when we see something that isn't right.
Yes, exactly. And what resonates so much with me about this case, it's that the court really, they put the focus where it belongs, on the victims. These young people were manipulated, abused, their trust was completely shattered.
Yeah.
But by listening to their stories, really listening and holding the perpetrator accountable, the court, I think, offered them at least some measure of justice, some closure,
Right.
and sent a really strong message to anyone else out there who might be thinking about exploiting vulnerable people.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that silence only benefits the abuser.
Mm-hmm.
If you see something, if you think something's off or you suspect exploitation, speak up. There are resources available. There are organizations that are ready and willing to help. You can make a difference.
That's right. You really can.
Well, listeners, we really hope that this deep dive into the complexities of human trafficking, the manipulation of faith, and ultimately the fight for justice has given you something to think about. Remember, knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay engaged. Until next time on The Deep Dive.